afternoon, everyone. Time for Frost Hollow Hall, chapter 13, which is called Frost Hollow Hall. Not at work again, said Will, as I passed his pa's shop half an hour later. The village clock had just chimed 10. Miss Fletcher would be wondering where I was, but I didn't have time to stop at the school and explain. I didn't have time for Will Potter neither. He was sweeping snow from the front steps, and though I tried to ignore him, he put down his broom and fell in beside me. You look different too. Kick your beak out, I said. Though the sun was shining, the cold made the tips of my ears sting. What's more, I was sick with nerves, and the last person on earth I wanted to see was Will. No need to be unfriendly. I glared at him. You snitched on me. So I did. It was a lousy thing to do. I'm sorry. Lost your bottle, did you? Maybe, but the Barringtons are our finest customers, see? If we lost that account, then... He trailed off, looking uneasy. So Mrs. Jessup didn't tell your pa, then? No, luckily. But only after I'd cleaned those chickens out within an inch of my life. And he smiled at me then, in that slow, lazy way of his that was meant to win me over, but actually got right up my nose. Glad it worked out so well for you, I said, hitching up my skirts. Now I'm in a hurry, so leave me be. As I walked on, my anger grew. I bet he'd had breakfast this morning. I bet he'd seen his pa today. And he'd have supper waiting for him when he'd done his day's work, with his whole family all sat round the table. It didn't seem fair, not one bit. I quickened my pace to get shot of him, but he stuck to me like a limpet all the way up Coombe Hill. Go away, Will, I said through gritted teeth. Not till you tell me where you're going. I did my best to walk even faster, but it was tricky underfoot where hooves and cartwheels had turned the snow to slush that had then frozen hard. Will offered me his arm. I don't need your help, I said, though in truth it was a job to stay upright. Suit yourself. Out on the main road, the ground got easier. We walked on in silence until finally Will said, You're going to get work at the hall, aren't you? You don't know everything, I snapped, feeling myself going red. I knew it. You're such a rubbish liar. Am not. I'd heard they was after a housemaid, said Will. You'd be just the ticket. You'd find out all sorts about Kit Barrington working there. Perhaps. I looked sideways at him. It wasn't worth telling Will anything, not after the stunt he pulled yesterday, bleating to Mrs. Jessup about my stupid ideas. But I felt so sick, I wasn't thinking right, and besides, Will knew how much this job meant to me. I just hope they'll have me, I said. You've swept a floor before, haven't you? Of course. Well then. Trouble is, things has changed. So I heard, said Will. My heart sank. What have you heard? That your pa and sister are gone away, and times is hard. News travelled fast in Frostcombe, but at least he'd spared me the gory details. It hurt enough already. I couldn't bear for someone as smug as Will Potter to point out all that was wrong with my family. If I mess it up, we'll be in the workhouse, I said. Ma's counting on me. So's Kit Barrington, he said, sharp as you like, or so you say. I don't need you telling me, tar very much. Get amongst them Barringtons then, said Will. Find out what makes them tick. It isn't that easy. If they catch me snooping, I'll be done for. Then make sure they don't. Keep your gob shut and your eyes open. It was all very well for Will to dish out advice when he didn't have to lift a finger himself. Just be careful, that's all, he said, suddenly serious. Since when do you care? We fell silent for a moment. Then his face lit up with a grin. You've changed your hair, haven't you, he said. Yes, I said, patting it gently. Is it all right still? Looked better before, if you ask me. Oaf, I thumped him. The gates to the hall were actually open for once. A man in a greatcoat was in the process of leading his pony and trap through them. He stopped to peer at us as we approached. You bound for the hall too, he said. Tar, but we'll walk, said Will. I stopped dead in my tracks. You ain't coming in with me? Oh, yes, I am, Will said, tucking his arm through mine. I know them down there, remember. I yanked my arm free, and a fat lot of help it was last time. I turned to the driver. Thank you. A ride would be grand. Will frowned. Now, I'm going by myself, I said firmly. Will gave me a long look. Then, without so much as a goodbye, he turned smartly on his heel. I felt a strange pang as I watched him go, like he was my last link with home, and I'd not been quite fair with him. Moments later, he was out of sight completely. There wasn't time to fret. The driver had already pulled the gates almost shut and was waiting for me to join him. I grabbed my skirts and squeezed through the gap. He heaved the gate shut behind us. My heart began to thud. "All aboard then," said the driver. I climbed into the trap and had barely sat down when the cart shot forward, flinging me backwards. We set off at a right pace. The cart spun over the packed snow, hurling me one way, then the other. I gripped the seat hard. It was all I could do to stay on board. Icy air stung my eyes. Hair whipped my face. On and on we raced through a blur of trees. I gritted my teeth and hung on tight as I could. And then the driver heaved on his reins. The cart slowed to walking pace and stopped. Before us, the road went downhill sharply, and the woods gave way to grand lines of trees on either side of the drive. "There it is," said the driver, nodding into the valley. "The grandest house in the county." I followed his gaze and gasped out loud. What an eyeful it was! On a day like today, the Frost Hollow business was as clear as anything. Already at the top of the valley, the snow had started to thaw, and yet deep at the bottom, everything was still thick white. Sat right in the coldest, frostiest spot of all was the house itself. For the first time, I got a real sense of its vastness. Frost Hollow Hall. Frost Hollow Palace, more like. It was shaped like a capital E, with the middle bit missing. The house was made of grey stone and was finer than any I'd ever clapped eyes on. The roof was a jumble of chimney pots and little slanty windows, all white with snow like a fairy tale castle. I bet the place was full of narrow stairways and secret passages, waiting to be explored. Off beyond the gardens was a familiar-looking path, leading through yew trees to what had to be the family graveyard. There was no sign of Kit's stone angel from up here, though. Everything was hidden by the dark trees. And where was the lake? I leaned forward on my seat, shivering with cold and excitement. There it was, set back beyond the graveyard, half screened by those great trees. It still had that dull grey look to it, like something solid and steady. Only I knew not to be fooled. "That's the lake, isn't it?" I said, trying to sound casual. "Aye." The driver flicked the reins. We started moving again. "It won't thaw out till spring," he said, "especially not this winter." "And the family? What do they use it for?" "You'll know the story. You're a Froscombe girl. Now leave it be." I felt him staring at me. I kept my eyes on the road. Soon we arrived at the side of the hall. Up close it was just as handsome. The drive had been cleared at the front of the house so that snow was heaped up either side. There were 3 floors to the house, 4 if you counted the attics, which meant a heck of a lot of windows. Each was made of old, watery glass split into little panes. On the ground floor, the shutters were already open, though the rooms were in shadow, so I couldn't quite see inside. A lump formed in my throat. One day, this would have all been Kit's. Should have been. "I'm headed for the stable block," said the driver, cutting through my sad thoughts. "You want the servants' entrance." He pointed over his shoulder at the cobbled yard I recognised from yesterday. "Grey door, by the railings. Can't miss it." "Tar very much," I said, and jumped down. The cart pulled away, leaving me alone in the driveway. I glanced up at the house again and began to feel uneasy. This whole place felt sad. Bleak. I scanned the windows. Each one stared back at me, blank and cold. Then I saw a movement. The drapes twitched at a large window on the first floor. A dark shape stepped back from the glass, disappearing from sight. The shivers ran through me. Someone had been up there, watching. Chapter 14. Interview with the housekeeper. I made my way to the servants' entrance. By now, I felt sicker than ever. 5 icy steps down, and the door was in front of me. I did a quick tidy of my hair and knocked on the door, breathed deep, and waited. No one came. I tried again, louder this time, and stepped back, smoothing my skirts. Where were they all? A big house like this and no one to answer a blasted door. I stamped my feet and blew on my hands. Maybe they'd just not heard me. Either way, it was too cold to stand there dithering. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The flagstone passageway and high windows were just as I remembered. Though it was daylight now, gas jets still burned on the walls. My nerve wavered, but I made myself keep going, past the laundry room and the butler's pantry. This time the glass door was shut and the lamps turned down. Where was everyone? I kept going, heart thudding. I turned the corner. Oh! I stopped dead. Up ahead was Mrs. Jessup. Her tall, dark shape filled the passageway. She saw me and froze. Do my eyes deceive me, or is this Tilly Higgins again? Please, Ma'am, I've come about the job. She came towards me like a vapour. My knees shook hard. The housemaid's job? You? She laughed in disbelief. You're persistent, I'll grant you that. She peered at me closely and seemed to mull something over. I waited, head bowed, praying cook had been right, that they were short-staffed and needed extra hands. I didn't fancy my chances otherwise. Mrs. Jessup sighed deeply. Come with me. I followed her down another corridor, so narrow that her skirts brushed against the walls as she walked. The keys at her hip caught my eye. There had to be 20 there at least, all shapes and sizes, some tarnished, some gleaming. One for every room in the house, I reckoned. We went up some stone steps. Then she reached for her keys and unlocked the door in front of us. We entered a smallish room with painted walls and a patterned carpet on the floor. An oil lamp hung from the ceiling, which made the air smell thick and close and filled the room with a yellow light. As Mrs. Jessup turned to stoke the fire, a set of shelves on the wall caught my eye. They were stacked high with notebooks. Each had a date on its spine, like October 78 or June 79, and seemed to be arranged in date order. And beneath the shelves was a wide, uncluttered desk where more notebooks sat in tidy piles. Mrs. Jessup then selected one, a small brown cardboard-covered thing, and took a seat in the corner near the fire. She told me to stand by the desk where she could see me properly. I folded my hands and bowed my head again. I hoped she wouldn't notice how I trembled. Mrs. Jessup opened her notebook. So, tell me, why should I hire you as my new housemaid? I looked up. She stared at me, unblinking. Her eyes were black. Well, I swallowed. I am a good worker. Where do you work currently? With Miss Fletcher at the school. Though I hoped she wouldn't bother checking this fact. Miss Fletcher had wanted me in bright and early today. Instead, I'd gone after another job. It didn't exactly look good. That may be so, said Mrs. Jessup. I shall be contacting her for your character. Drat, I thought, as she scribbled something down. There are other matters to be considered, Tilly. I lowered my gaze. Twice you've been caught trespassing in the last week alone, and now you're asking for a job? I felt myself go red. I didn't have a cat in hell's chance, did I? I was stupid to even be here. I'm sorry, I said. I've wasted your time. I went to go. Thoughts of Ma, the landlord and Kit all rushed into my head at once, and I felt so ill and low I hardly knew what I'd do next. Stop right there, young lady, said Mrs. Jessup. I haven't dismissed you yet. I groaned silently and turned to face her again. Go on then. Put me out of my misery once and for all. I want a sensible girl who pulls her weight, not some troublemaker. Do I make myself clear? Yes, Mrs. Jessup. A rustling of skirts and she was stood beside me. She smelled clean and sharp like beeswax. Now, she said, stepping even closer. Open wide. Sorry? Her hand shot out and gripped my jaw. I pulled back, but her fingers dug harder into my flesh, so I couldn't move an inch. Your teeth, she said. I need to see them. It hurt to struggle, and I couldn't breathe right with her hand clamped tight round my face. I stood still. She loomed over me, all bony and pale, just like before. Only this time I kept my eyes wide open and saw how she looked at me, tipping her head this way and that, like I was an insect trapped in a jar. Finally she let go. Good. Now hold your hands out. She peered at my nails and fingers, then turned my hands over to examine the palms. She said, nothing a good scrub won't put right. But I had a wash this morning, she tutted, which made me go red again. Then she returned to her seat and wrote something down in her book. You don't have any followers, she said, peering at me under her brows. Followers? Young men of your acquaintance, village boys who'll come calling for you and making a nuisance of themselves. Only we don't allow that sort of thing. No, Mrs. Jessup. Not even that butcher's boy? Most definitely not, I said, a little too hotly. She pulled a face like she didn't quite believe me, then pressed her fingers to her lips and frowned. Very well. It's a week's trial. You'll be paid 5 shillings next Wednesday. Any nonsense and you're out. I could hardly believe my own ears. Oh, thank you, you won't regret it, I promise. I rushed towards her like a daft thing, catching my foot on the corner of the carpet, so I stumbled against her desk. Notebooks, pens, cards, all slid to the floor. Heck, I'm sorry. I fell to my knees to gather up the mess. In a flash, Mrs. Jessup was beside me, her skirt hem inches from my face. Spotless black merino, not a speck, not a hair upon it. As I glanced up, she looked at me almost kindly. Then her face darkened. Give me that notebook. I looked down at the book in my hand. It didn't seem much, just an old tatty thing. Its pages were open and covered in tiny handwriting. I passed it to her without a second glance. Now get up, for goodness sake. Tutting loudly, she turned to tidy the desk. My heart was in my mouth. She was bound to change her mind now and send me packing. But instead, she said, Did you bring any things with you? I shook my head. Does your mother know you're here? Yes, but she don't know I'm staying, I said. That soft look crossed her face again. Then she squared her shoulders and headed for the door. We'll get a message to your mother, Mrs. Jessup said briskly, and now you can join the others. They're having their break in the servants' hall. Chapter 15. Below Stairs. I followed Mrs. Jessup down yet another passageway. We went through a door into a well-lit room, where 8, maybe 10 people were gathered round one end of a long table. Tea was being poured. Plates of buttered bread passed round. At first glance it looked proper cosy, and my poor stomach rumbled at the sight of such a lovely meal. Yet despite a good fire, the room was chill. It felt big and bare, not altogether welcoming. The people sat with their backs to us, speaking in low voices. Mrs. Jessup cleared her throat. The talking stopped abruptly, and faces turned our way. I wiped my hands on my skirt, swallowing hard. Mrs. Jessup went over to a man in a dark jacket who was sat at the head of the table. I'd seen him before. He was Mr. Phelps, the butler. Mrs. Jessup spoke rapidly in his ear. He nodded a few times and looked at me before dabbing his mouth with a napkin and getting to his feet. Everyone else got up too. Sit, sit, he cried, waving them back into their seats. They sat down again. Now then, he said, this is our new housemaid, Matilda Higgins from the village. I felt myself shrink inside my clothes. Welcome to you, Matilda. Mrs. Jessup said, Mr. Phelps, it's Tilly, not Matilda, just so we're clear. Thank you, Mrs. J. Mr. Phelps shot her a look before addressing 2 maids sat across the table from him. Now, Dorcas, you'll need to get Matilda kitted out. Gracie can assist you. The older maid nodded. I'd seen her here yesterday, hadn't I? She was the pretty head housemaid who'd had to chop vegetables. Everything about her was neat and clean, including her white frilled cap, which sat perfectly in place. Next to her was a younger, plump-faced girl with dark, dancing eyes. She looked nearer my age. I tried to smile. The dark-eyed girl grinned back, showing a gap between her 2 front teeth. Dorcas, though, looked at me coolly, and I felt myself colour up again. Ah, Mr. Phelps, Mrs. Jessup butted in. I should like to take charge of Tilly directly, for today at least. Dorcas has plenty to do already. Mr. Phelps twitched like a fly was bothering him. The other people watched. In this house, it is not a housekeeper's duty to train up new staff, he said. It is the responsibility of the head housemaid, and Dorcas is more than capable of performing such a task. But on this occasion, thank you, Mrs. Jessup. Mr. Phelps held up his hand. We must try to keep to our proper roles where possible. Now let us finish our meal. Mr. Phelps took his seat again and beckoned me over. Matilda, sit with Gracie and have something to eat. As I slid into a seat next to the dark-eyed girl, I noticed Mrs. Jessup had gone. Hello, I'm Gracie Waite. The girl held out a buttery hand, then snatched it back again. Oops, sorry, should have wiped it first. So this was the famous Gracie who'd taken to her bed yesterday. She certainly didn't look sick today, and she seemed so friendly that I liked her at once. Hello, I said. What's with you and Mrs. Jessup then, Gracie said, her eyes darting over my face. She's keeping a watch on me, I expect. Thinks I'm a lost cause already. And I told her about knocking the notebooks on the floor. Gracie's face fell. Oh, Lordy, not them notebooks. What do you mean? But she started to giggle and I saw she was just having a bit of fun. I shouldn't laugh, she said. Mrs. Jessup keeps a record of everything. But don't look so worried. All housekeepers write a journal. Only she's very particular about hers. She passed me some bread, but my guts were too knotted. I found I couldn't manage anything after all. I took a small slice and went to stuff it in my pocket, thinking I'd be starved come midday. Gracie grinned as she watched me. We have our dinner at 1 o'clock. It's a big hot meal with pudding and everything. Believe me, you won't go hungry working here. I felt a right idiot, so I put the food back on my plate, hoped no one else had noticed. The others started to leave the table now. I recognised the carter who brought me here, joking with his lad from the stables. Another maid cleared the plates away, whistling a tune as she did so. I noticed Cook talking to Mr. Phelps. And along from us, next to Dorcas, 2 very tall men in breeches and brass-button coats laughed as they downed the last of their tea. They all seemed happy enough. I thought of how cosy they'd looked when I first clapped eyes on them. Maybe I'd just imagined the rest. That's Samuel Ketteridge, the footman, said Gracie, who'd noticed me staring, and the lanky one's Peter Watson, the second footman. She went pink as she said his name. Dorcas then got to her feet. Right, Tilly, let's get you sorted. As I stood up, she turned to Gracie. You're to make up a bed for Tilly in your room. Gracie pouted. Do I have to go up there? It's daylight, you silly fool. Nothing's going to harm you. That's what you said on Sunday, and then look what happened. Dorcas cut in. And now you've got someone to share with. Isn't that nice? Just what you wanted. So Gracie went one way, and we went the other. Right at the end of the passage, we came to a small room with cupboards all along one wall. It was icy cold in here. No fire burned in the grate. Dorcas shut the door behind us. I know who you are, she said. Half dead you were when Will Potter brought you in. We laid you out on the kitchen table to get the water out of your lungs. Lord knows you were lucky not to perish. I kept my eyes down. But I trust there'll be no more dramatics. Mrs. Jessup's already warned me, I said. Then thinking this sounded pert, quickly added, I promise to do my best. Honest I do. Good girl. I caught Dorcas's eye and she smiled. 2 dimples appearing in her cheeks, so she was prettier than ever. I bet Will Potter thought her handsome when he came here on his deliveries, though I couldn't imagine her looking twice at a louse like him. Dorcas went to a drawer and got out a tape and started to measure me up. You're quite small, aren't you, she said, looking me up and down like I was a pig and she was the blinking farmer. Hope we've got something that'll fit. She climbed up on a chair and started rooting around in a cupboard full of linens. Your uniform, she said, handing me a pile of clothes. Try them on for size. Shivering, I stripped down to my slip, grateful for Ma's gift of decent undergarments. First, I tried on a striped grey cotton dress like the one Dorcas and Gracie were wearing. The fabric was stiff and smelled of soap. You wear this in the mornings when you're cleaning and laying the fires, Dorcas said as I wriggled into it. Turn round, raise your arms. Fits you well. Next she gave me a plain pinny and a white cap. These go on top. You'll need to keep your hair tucked right under. Here, like this. She smoothed my hair back tight to my head. Then she handed me a finer dress in black wool. I rubbed it between my fingers. So soft and warm. I'd never worn such a thing in my life. Nice, isn't it? You'll wear it in the afternoons and evenings for when you're called upstairs. Upstairs? To the Barringtons? She frowned. That isn't going to be a problem, is it? Of course not. I'll be fine, I said, when really my insides were fluttering. Good. She locked up the cupboards and pocketed the key. You'll need to be in this house. That's it for today. See you tomorrow. Bye.